Welcome to the Audiation in the Wild podcast with your hosts, Bo Talifer and Eric Rasmussen.
So, Eric, I thought it'd be interesting to talk about. Eric, I thought it'd be interesting today to talk about the relation of memory to, well, this whole larger conversation, audiation, MLT, the more specific parts of music learning theory. But I thought a great place to start would be this issue when you talk about memorizing music or memorizing whatever it is, a tonal pattern or how to play a song or a rhythm pattern. We have this issue that comes up with the precise definition, because when someone says, I memorized how to play a song, that may or may not be related to what we want to actually be talking about here, because as we talked about on the last couple episodes, there are ways that you can play songs by decoding or memorizing something theoretically, or memorizing how to visually play it on an instrument or how to tactily play it, that aren't related to audiation. And so I thought that's a good place to start, because when I'm talking about, my interest in memory and audiation, I'm not necessarily talking about memory or memorization and these other ways of kind of being able to play something without using audiation. And so you introduced this idea of, that's why we should maybe just have a specific term for this, call it recall.
Well, Dr. Gordon made a distinction between recall, because you can, once you get rolling, your audiation gets put into play as you're. I think this is exactly what I said in the last episode, is that you don't have to have something memorized to be able to recall it in audiation. But if you play something recalled in audiation enough times, you might call that memorization, but it's a particular type of audiation, or a specific type of memorization, which relies on recall, or you could get away with doing without this audiation, and which would be some kind of, what are the two? Procedural and...
So this is what I want to talk about. There's a difference between, in learning psychology, there's a lot of different types of memory, but the two big distinctions are the difference between procedural memory and declarative memory. And, a simple analogy for this is knowing how to ride a bike kinesthetically is a type of procedural memory. You know how to carry out the action and do it. Declarative memory would be, linguistic explanation of how to do that. So when we're talking about audiation, to me, it seems like recall is like the procedural memory for audiation, and memory, like recalling something would be procedural, and memorizing something based off of knowing what the names of the notes are, or even the names of the solfege letters,
Right.
syllables, or how to organize something theoretically, would be a declarative type of memory.
Like knowing the physical rules of balance. Right? Is that... It doesn't get you to ride a bike.
No, and in a larger sense, this conversation is going on even outside of the MLT community, because a lot of people that aren't versed in MLT talk about the difference between learning something by ear and learning how to play theoretically or ground up using pitch letters and decoding and stuff. And we see this in the Suzuki community. The Suzuki community has taken a more by ear approach, even though, their recommendation is to listen to the songs a lot, and they seem to get you to kinesthetically memorize something. They might not even necessarily be forcing you to be recalling audiated things. They kind of assume that it will happen naturally if you listen to the music enough, but I still don't think it necessarily always will. You could still have someone listening to the songs a lot and then kinesthetically just memorizing them on their instrument. So what's weird is, like, in that situation, you could have someone who's playing an instrument through kinesthetic memory, but they're still in the stage of audiation where, when they're hearing themselves play, it's like they're just listening to familiar music. It's not like they're actually recalling it from their audiation, which is very odd.
So let's break this down to something. I've got a kid in front of me.
Yeah,
They sing sometimes. So, and when they do, they're sometimes in tune or getting some of the, they might be able to get the resting tone or, a few other tones along the way, but it's not consistently singing in tune. So, what's going to help that? Well, we got to break it down and give them some tonal patterns, right?
sure.
And so I sing a tonal pattern, and the kid, uh, might be able to imitate it and sing it back to you properly in tune. Um, but that might be imitation, right?
Yeah,
Because they may not be able to hold on to it, but at least they recognized the pattern and held it in their brain long enough to imitate it and to momentarily recall it long enough to hear it, um, digest it somehow, you know,
yep.
hold it in their short term memory. Maybe they're in the first or second stage of audiation, and then they can repeat it back, and it's either right or not right. If it's not right, we know they're not audiating, but they're getting close to imitation, or they're imitating it, and we don't know if it's quite audiation unless they can do it consistently, and it also helps improve their longer term memory of that pattern in terms of where it is in the sequence, or you know where they start to. And then we got to bring up these two words: is the difference between recognition and identification. So
So yeah. So I think there's four kind of things that cross here. So you have short-term memory, long-term memory, recognition and identification, as you're trying to say it. So like where, like, what is imitation then, right? So like if I hear something, like, Eric, I'd love to see what you think about this. I transcribe songs all the time for people in lessons. That's basically how my lessons function. What do you want to learn? I listen to it. I'm figuring out how to play it on the fly, and I teach it to them by rote and by imitation often. Now, if I hear something and I can actually recognize what the tonality is, what the meter is, what all the tonal patterns are, to the point where I can just play it now. But here's the crucial part. It's only in my short-term memory for a few seconds. So I could copy it after a few seconds of hearing it, even though I can audiate the whole thing. But if you asked me to play that song in a month, I would not be able to recall that song from my memory. Where am I in that situation? What's happening to me in that situation? Because I'm audiating things and I can recognize them or identify them. I don't know how you're using those terms
so
exactly, but I don't retain the music in my musical memory for longer than 10 minutes, even though the individual tonal patterns and rhythm patterns and stuff are online in my mind. So what's happening in that situation?
um time. I guess you're just done them enough to have them stick or have a longer stick. And we talked about this in the last
Hmm.
episode as well. It's the sticking power of, uh, and you might get that from, just repetitions, right? But we want to have the repetitions have some kind of context, of course. That's why we're teaching, tonal patterns in tonic and dominant, or rhythm patterns with macro and micro and different combinations, so that we have established a context. And then when you're recognizing stuff in that initial stages of ideation, and then you can actually identify things when you can put language to what it is that I think that comes more at the end of verbal association and the beginning of partial synthesis, is when not only can you recognize, oh, that's the pattern from that song, but not know that it's, bum bum, or whatever the pattern is that you're focused on and drawing
Yeah.
attention to. So one is recognition. Oh, I recognize that lady. Oh, I know that lady from somewhere. But then it's like, oh, it's Miss Jones. I know. Do you know? Anyway, um, So that now you've identified her. So there's recognition, identification, and the same thing happens in music. You recognize something and then later can identify it by adding a verbal association or adding a label or adding another anchor to, right now we're talking about a pattern or in your case, a
Mm,
song. And a song is
mm.
just a bunch of patterns. So, but you're at a high level of being able to take a song, break it down, play it, and get it in your ear long enough to put it on paper to give you a cheat sheet when you're working with a student because you're not going to spend an inordinate amount of time to get it down unless it's a tune you want to know and have for the bandstand like that.
Sure.
So there's a certain amount of work to put
I mean, by the
into.
way, this does happen once in a while. Sometimes a student asks me to learn a song, or asks to learn a song from a video game, and the changes are just ludicrous. Like it's not something I can audiate under like 15 seconds, and
Yeah,
I will just tell them like, look, this is not a song you want me to figure out in real time in the lesson. Let me just work on this for 10 minutes on my own time. But traditionally, I don't have that issue
yeah,
anymore. I can usually handle whatever they throw at me.
yeah, because you
Um,
got enough patterns that you recognize and can identify already stored in I would call in your recall. Uh,
which
when
is really interesting about this is like this is one of the things I wanted to talk about, both with rhythm patterns and tonal patterns, but other things too, is that like having those things in your recall memorized, having gone through the sequence, it's remarkable how much it increases your ability to just identify those things when you're listening to music. And I've seen this with students, I'm sure you have. It's the whole reason we do tonal patterns and rhythm patterns, but it's remarkable, the quality of their listening audiation when they have the tonal patterns and rhythm patterns in their recall. It's remarkable how much it goes up. The students will just start saying things like, hey, that sounds like this song, or that they might not even want to refer to it by the name of the tonal pattern, but you show them something and they'll just tell you, hey, that sounds like that other song.
but
And it's good, you can.
isn't that the difference between stage three, stage four in there where you're right? This is how Gordon came up with these
Yeah,
stages. They're theoretical. He
yeah.
just invented them, thinking about what it is that kids do when they're learning to audiate, or how far he could take his own audiation.
Can I read the difference between stage 4 and stage 5?
Oh, sure.
I mean, stage 1 is momentary retention. Stage 2 is imitating and audiating tonal patterns and rhythm patterns, recognizing and identifying a tonal setter. Stage 3 is establishing objective or subjective tonality and meter. So stage 4 and 5, here's really where I wanted to get to. The difference between retaining in audiation tonal patterns and rhythm patterns that have been organized. So in stage 4, you're retaining them. They're kind of there. But in stage 5, you're actually just recalling them, tonal patterns and rhythm patterns,
And making
in order.
comparisons.
Yeah, yeah. And then stage 6, we're actually
So
anticipating and predicting
so
things.
isn't that kind of an identification? It's like, oh, I identify that with these other patterns that are close enough to patterns I've already quote unquote memorized or can recall easily.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Because
Yeah, it's go ahead.
memorization through recall is, it's like being able to, you know, don't ask me what the 12th pattern of a Gordon uh, sequence of tonal patterns. I go do mi do re ti re do so do re ti so, and I can get to the 12th one. I go, oh, that's the 12th one, but
So this
I don't have it memorized. Like, okay, well, you could do. Well, I know 16 is do mi do because it goes
but that
back to
is
the
kind of the
first.
difference. That is kind of the difference between procedural and declarative memory, and we were talking about this before, is that if you can procedurally execute a series of tonal patterns like in one of those sequences, like in the jump right in or your own. I use Andy Mullen's
Yeah,
tonal patterns for the just because they're memorized, so I'm like, why would I memorize a different set right now? But, to answer the question, what was the 12th tonal pattern in that sequence, it requires some kind of theoretical or verbal description of that, and that's declarative memory. So, I mean, that's actually really interesting. You can see the difference between those two just in something like memorizing a set of familiar tonal patterns.
and there are people out in the world who probably do both simultaneously. They're just monsters. But with a regular kid with a high or even whatever, not necessarily super high.
Well, I
aptitude
mean,
in music.
a good example of that is like when I learn tunes now that are, I'm very sensitive to the form of the tune, especially if I'm learning a classical piece, and it's a bit it's a bit weirder in terms of what sections repeat. But I found that if you play through the song always from beginning to ending, the type of memory that you develop for the piece is a memory that will procedurally take you from the beginning to the ending. But if you sometimes play starting in the second section, in the B section, or in the second A section, or however you want to call these sections, I just give them letters. You tend to develop this ability to answer those questions. You know, what's the third section of the piece, or what's the third, and that doesn't necessarily happen by just playing through the piece over and over
Yeah.
again.
In high school, I was in in I'm sorry.
No, no, go ahead. Go ahead.
In high school, I was in the marching band starting between my seventh and eighth grade year. And the high school was 10, 11, 12. So I had 2 years of high school marching band just because they wanted to make the marching band bigger. And I was, one of the upper level performing middle school trumpet players. So anyway, we would obviously have to memorize our music, and that was like, here's your music, go memorize it. We'll play it, and you can read it for a couple weeks or whatever. But at some point, you had to play wherever from memory. And one of the
Mm,
tricks, we'd start at the beginning and go 4 bars and see, or go 2 bars, or however far you could get, and you'd start fall apart, and then you work on those 2 measures until you could fall
mm-hmm,
apart, whatever. But band director suggested, hey, start at the end and do the last measure and the measure before that and the last measure. And then by the time you do both ways, going frontwards and backwards, I would get to the point where, and I don't know that that didn't eventually turn into audiation for me,
yeah.
somehow, because I don't think anybody's learning music without anything. If you've got some level of music aptitude,
Mm-hmm.
you can avoid audiation if you really try. Um, but I think that eventually, if you've got enough early childhood music experience, that you bring that to bear, and then it turns into audiation. I don't think it always has to be necessarily taught formally through pattern. This is why we call it
Oh
audiation in
yeah.
the
Oh yeah.
wild,
And I
right?
mean,
So I
yeah,
don't I
yeah.
don't think I wasn't audiating, but I think there was a level to which I wasn't, audiating at
I
those.
totally agree. And I actually think it's very common for people when they learn a piece that they will be audiating different parts of the piece at different levels. Like if the start of a piece is just 1 4 5 in minor and you have that down, you're gonna be auditing that, at a very high level if that's where you are in the sequence. But then if all of a sudden the bridge is a bunch of like chromatic descending like minor nine chords or something like that, I do think this happens a lot where people will they'll get through part of a song relying on like a very central audiated based memory or recall, and then another part of the song they might be instrumentally theoretically be pushing through by like, oh yeah, this is just descending, dominant seventh chords, which happens all the time in jazz, and I think that happens to a lot of people. But I think there's a point though, once you get a grip on what Gordon's talking about and how to actually take yourself through these sequences, for me anyway, it becomes more of a point of just being able to tell when you're not audiating something well. So if you wanted to bring it up to the level of, your 1 4 5 or whatever you else you have under your belt, you're just aware like, okay, well right now I'm actually decoding this, which is, it's not a sin. Like we don't have to repent for decoding, but I think it's more of a sense of, are you able to mindfully tell when you are decoding? Because some, as we talked about in the last podcast on decoding, or a couple podcasts ago now, there are some like 21st century types of music that I highly doubt you're not gonna just crack open Sibelius, or not Sibelius, Scriabin,
Yeah.
and just you're not gonna want to initially look at everything like that. You're going to need to bring some other skills, or even just things that are very all over the place that could be super subjective. You might actually need to do some decoding at the start, but the question is, can you actually tell when you're decoding and you can't audiate something yet? Because then you can take yourself through the sequence, and it doesn't become as much of a danger. But when you don't know, that these different things are possible, You can kind of get into what happens, I think, at a lot of band programs where you can kind of audiate some of it, but then some of it's just tactile memory or theoretical memory or whatever it is. I think that's pretty common actually, for
Yeah,
it to be kind of a grab bag.
yeah,
Um,
yeah, for sure. And I know, 100% that most of the harmonic context of what I was playing had gone missing. I could play the notes, play the rhythms, and yes, I was decoding to be able to get there, but going through the side door and then
hmm.
learning to audiate along the way certainly wasn't efficient way for me to become a better
Yeah.
musician. And then next year you start at zero again because you got six more pieces of music or eight or whatever.
And they might not be sequenced like in a way that makes sense. Like the harmonic content of what you received in your first year might have actually been a lot harder than what you receive in
Oh,
your
for
second year.
sure.
It might be all over the place because they might be giving it to you based on your just technical ability to execute the phrases, not the audiated difficulty of the phrases or the pieces.
Yep.
One thing with harmony too, like I noticed in terms of um say we're in a key or a tonality that I know and very familiar with. If you just tell me the name of one of the whether the solfege syllable or the pitch letter name, my mind can like kind of pivot between different harmonic functions that would go under it. So like if we're in, if we're in the key of B flat and you say I'm playing a D note, my mind can pivot between all these functions that could sit under that D note as like an appropriate um, harmonic
Y-
implication. And I
y-
noticed that as my harmonic kind of ability has grown.
yeah,
Um,
you're holding the context of that chord in whatever tonality you're in, and then that D inside that chord could be representing something else where depending on where you're moving from and to. And so you're instantly certainly recognizing, identifying it, you know, going through stage 5, and then 6 is predicting what's next, and you've already got that cycling,
yeah, yeah,
in every millisecond or whatever, whatever, however, was it microseconds? I don't know how quickly,
yeah.
the brain's actually working there in terms of its capacity.
I
Like
mean,
what?
this has actually become like somewhat of a litmus test for how well I can audiate functions in a certain keyality or tonality is like how many functions come to mind when you say the name of one pitch letter name or one verbal associate in that keyality or tonality.
Yeah.
I mean, this is something that Joe Pass actually used to do, and I think this is how I started doing this. But when Joe Pass practiced his scales, he would play a chord voicing, in a certain inversion, and then just play the scale from the root up to the top of that certain voicing note, and he would just randomly change chords. And yeah, I think it does kind of because if you go back, the normal way that we learn how to associate functions with whether syllable names or pitch letter names is we think of the function first. So we think of the one chord in major, and we think do mi so or whatever. But once you have enough of those in your mind, you can kind of reverse engineer it. You can say, well, what is so attached to? Not just theoretically, but in your audiation.
Hmm.
And I know you can do this too, Eric. Like I've heard you talk about this too. But it's just it's very fascinating because yeah, the experience is much different
Yeah.
than
And so where this intersects too is these stages of audiation and identification recognition is if you take a look at the intermediate and the primary measures of music audiation, you don't have to identify anything. You have to recognize was that pattern the same or different than the
yeah.
first pattern. So, you hear Pat.
Which is why I think what aptitude is measuring is a type of musical working memory, because if your ability to make those comparisons is dependent on your working memory to hold something in your mind even though you can't identify it. So you
Yep.
said, you play me a tonal pattern, or you play a kid a tonal pattern, and then
And
you
you
have to
don't.
hold that in their memory and you say, is this the same or different?
Yeah, and not give the kid enough chance in between hearing that second one to replay the first one in their mind. So you don't have
Yeah,
time to.
because
You gotta you gotta cut that short so that you're using some kind of gut response, not a
yeah,
learning. Some kids could learn that pattern easier, but not necessarily have that gut response to it, and in order to be able to answer
exactly.
the question correctly.
But that's why I do think it is a type of musical working memory, because those are things that working memory would have to take care of. Your ability to hold something in mind while you're actually attending to another task is, like, essentially the definition of working memory. I mean, we can do this with math, your ability to just hold numbers in your mind while you perform operations on them. It's kind of similar what's going on with these aptitude and audiation
And the more
like
connections
tests.
you make to a particular fact or pattern or anything, the better you're able to retain it. That's why these people
Yep.
who win these memorization contests, like, remember like 6 decks of cards that are all shuffled, right?
I
And then
so
they and they
I can
it's
memorize a
crazy.
deck of cards in about 6 or 7 minutes now. That's
Oh,
about
you
as
can
slow
do
as I.
that?
Yeah, it's I used to be able to do it. My lowest was like in the 5 minute range, but I was training this for a while. It's quite silly, and it's very. Trust me, I don't have a good memory. I don't have a good natural memory. This is entirely
Well,
artificial.
neither did this news reporter, but he spent a year he was like, how is this possible? And the guy said, oh, it's simple. I'll train you how to do it. And you can come back next year. And the guy came back next year. He's just a news reporter reporting on the
Yeah,
contest.
that's
And
yeah. The book is Moonwalking with Einstein. I forget the name of the author. I think, is it Joshua something? I'm forgetting the
I
name,
don't know
but
offhand.
I mean, ironically, but yeah, he. I think he ended up winning the world championship
Joshua
of
Foer, F
Oh,
O
it is
E R.
Joshua.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
So, but
yeah, that was actually the book that got me into that.
you could train yourself in some kind of memorization game, but that doesn't get
This is
you
a really important point, actually. Yeah.
it doesn't get you to that procedural memory.
Yeah, mnemonics don't help with procedural memory. So, for example, if I wanted to memorize if you shuffle a deck and give me the deck, and I memorize the order of the cards, what I'm actually doing is I'm attaching like an image to each card. Actually, I do 3 cards in one. I use a system that does that. But so I take 3 cards and I make a picture out of it in my mind, and I put this picture in my memory palace, and it actually works. It's ludicrous. If you haven't done this, I suggest putting in uh, you know 20 minutes a day for a month. It's a good party trick. It's fun. But the problem is you can't use that to change your procedural memory. So if I want to memorize, say I want to memorize the tonal patterns in a series, and I was going to give them all, every time you give me a tonal pattern, I'm going to associate like a weird memory kind of mnemonic trick, whether it's an image that I'm going to place in a memory palace, or some kind of mnemonic trick with linguistics. It won't help audiation. It may help the recall of things I can already audiate. So if I can already audiate something and it's in my memory, it might help me remember how the start of a song goes. Like, I don't know, if the start of the song is has a certain tonal pattern and I give it a silly kind of image in my mind, it might be able to jog my memory, but it won't actually help me get to the point where I'm getting the audiated sounds kind of in my mind to begin with, and be able to be recalled. It can't help with that. That's the kind of the downfall of mnemonics, and it seems why um, a lot of people that I've met that get into that kind of memory training eventually stop doing it, because it really is only good for declarative memory. Now, if you want to be like a neuroscientist and you have to remember like a textbook worth of information, it's absurdly powerful. It's really, really powerful. But with audiation, I don't think it can help in that way.
I'm just curious, like how this might, again, now I got a different interface I'm considering, and that is,
Mm-hmm.
I wanted the kids got enough tonic and dominant, subdominant patterns in major and minor, and
Mm-hmm.
now I want to bridge up to some generalization or some creativity stuff. Say every time, and this is one of the typical exercises you do is like in creativity, I'm going to sing a tonic pattern. If I sing a
Mm-hmm.
tonic pattern, you sing a dominant pattern back to me. If I sing a dominant pattern, you know, you sing a tonic pattern back to me. So, or sing a tonic pattern, you sing a different tonic pattern, which is easier,
Mm,
right?
mm,
Or give the kid full range of all the patterns that they have, sing a pattern back to me that's not my own pattern. Then you can see where the kid might be exploring, where you're giving him more a chance to to create, uh,
yeah.
without any restrictions, and what's easier and how do you do this? So you sing do,
Mm-hmm.
establish tonality, and do mi so. If I sing do mi so or so mi do, you have to sing a pattern that has so fa re ti in it. It doesn't have to be all four. So fa, you can sing so re so he so g,
Mm-hmm.
whatever. You give the kids the directions, and then you demonstrate that pretend I'm now giving myself a pattern, and now I have to sing this kind of pattern back. And then, what is that kid showing you? He's showing you how stable all the tonal patterns he's learned or she's learned at the oral and then verbal association level, and can we don't need to use symbolic association. Totally skip that. Or,
Sure.
that's like a side trip. This is another podcast episode. Is the advantage of learning, any notation at all. Um,
Well,
we
actually, I
got
mean, you can. I'm convinced you can go to theoretical understanding without doing symbolic association. You totally can. Like, talk to
yeah,
countless jazz musicians.
yeah,
That's what they do. Is
yeah,
they do verbal associates
yeah.
with
So
something, and then
that's
they skip.
that's a
Anyways,
side
yeah,
trip, and we got into that with this notational audiation versus,
yeah,
in the last episode, uh, that we put out. Um, so what what are we asking kids to do, and what's easier? Can we measure what they've learned by advancing into these higher levels of skill learning sequence,
hmm,
and checking in, and then knowing from their responses what we need to go back and do a better job of, what patterns, and
yeah, yeah. Well, and I mean, I think this kind of links to the next thing I thought we should talk about is the importance of retrieval practice for memory. I brought this up a couple podcasts ago, and I recommended a book called Make It Stick. There's a researcher. I'm forgetting his first name. His last name is Rodiger. I think it might be Henry, but I think I might be butchering that. But Rodiger and one of his associates, they've done so much work on the effects of retrieval practice. So, I mean, one of the studies that they were looking at was learning words in another language, and they were using Swahili, if I'm not mistaken, because most North Americans don't know any Swahili words. So these words had the benefit of people could learn them through flashcards, their definitions. Um, and they had the study subjects look at something in the range of 20 to 40 words, but they studied the difference of what happens if you are exposed to each of these words in a flashcard sequence 3 times based on your learning versus exposed to the words and have to answer a test on them every single round, and so have to retrieve the information or retrieve the answer from your memory. And there's no debate in the literature on this. um, just exposing someone to the information does very little for their long-term recall on this. Forcing them to answer a test on it
mm-hmm,
produces amazing benefits. And so, this really got in my mind because this is great for declarative knowledge, but it also works for procedural knowledge too. So, you know, to tie this back to what Eric was just saying, these activities where you ask students, repeat a tonic pattern, or when I sing a tonic pattern, sing a dominant pattern, it's dependent on them being able to actually have those patterns in their recall and have different patterns in their recall. And so, I think basically you have to get students to practice retrieval at some point. And, this is probably tied to why I'd like to hear what you think about this, Eric. But like this concept of familiar patterns in familiar order, which I actually didn't really um I didn't really appreciate the gravity of this until I actually started memorizing sets of tonal patterns and trying to deliver them to students. And you can watch yourself go through the process of like, it's profoundly easier to do this when it's a familiar set of patterns in a familiar order first,
Yeah, and
right?
the value of that when you're teaching reading, it's like I don't need to read this. I already know it. But then what I suggest we're actually doing is training the brain to be a synesthetic animal, like that eyes and audiation become, one
Mhm.
and the same at the highest level. It would be that. Oh, by the way, the Make It Stick, the science of successful learning, Peter
Mhm.
Brown, and then the guy you mentioned too,
So Peter Brown was the author. Peter Brown was,
and
I think, the
Henry Roediger or
oh, it is
Roediger,
Roediger.
it's him, and then Mark A. McDaniel.
There's another guy that worked with Roediger that's worth checking out too, Karpicki. I actually emailed him about some of this stuff like a year ago, and I was talking to him. He's a nice guy to respond to my email. I think I was asking if he had seen the effective retrieval practice on musicians. He said he didn't
Yeah,
know too much about it, but it's been demonstrated in pretty much every field, and I have no doubt in my mind that anyone who's tried to memorize tonal patterns has come across this problem. Um, you have to memorize them,
but
and you have to practice retrieval to memorize them.
yeah, yeah. Um, and so back to your point is those patterns in success, in
Yep.
familiar order, makes reading a piece of cake. And if you do enough reading in familiar order,
Mhm.
those patterns become identified when they're not in familiar order, or
For sure.
when they're out of order. And then kids are now, you know coming down, uh down hard on, some challenges, or you put them back in familiar order, and then give them completely unfamiliar patterns. Now you're gone up to generalization,
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
where it has to be an unfamiliar pattern, and obviously in unfamiliar order, and that's where we
No,
get
I.
to
I.
sight reading, which we talked about in the last episode. This all
Yeah.
runs together now.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I haven't seen as much of a need for this with the rhythm learning sequence, the familiar patterns and familiar order, because during each stage of the learning sequence, there's not that many patterns that you would even introduce, but the amount of tonal patterns you could introduce with just tonic and dominant, I mean, it's absurd.
Yes.
Right? So like, but if you're just introducing microbeats and macrobeats, yes, there's a lot of orders you can put them in,
Yeah,
but it does
there's
not compare
less
to the amount of
less
yeah,
permutations is basically all it comes down to.
yeah.
And if you got do
So
today, well, do data. I had a kid come up to me, say, well, this pattern is just due to data, but there's an extra, and due to data data. Why is that any harder than due to data? I had a kid, first grade or second grade, explain to me her process of of why patterns were easier for her. I said, what?
mhm,
This is just easy for you. And she says, well, I just look at it and I see this pattern, and it's really the same as that pattern in the other meter. I just have to
mhm.
think of it in threes instead of in twos. And
I do think people are acculturated less to subdivisions in triple than in duple.
oh yeah, oh, the
Yeah.
acculturation is critical for all of this. In fact, right? So
I mean, I
before,
actually think this is one of the downfalls in like a traditional concert band class that, or in instrumental music that teaches songs in 3/4, air quote. They don't realize they're trying to get students to audiate subdivisions in triple, and they're not at that point in the sequence where they can do that, and that's often why it doesn't work. So if you see students who are struggling to play something in 3/4 with eighth notes, it's because they can't audiate subdivisions in triple yet.
how much band music did I listen to before I was in a band? Right,
Yeah,
zero,
yeah.
right, or whatever it was. No, my dad listened to orchestra, and this other stuff, crazy stuff, Spike Jones. Um,
Mhm.
uh, his music is just insane and so funny. Um, but if you're not acculturated in what band sounds like, why is not some of the homework the band director should be saying? Listen to these, and it doesn't have to be any of the repertoire that you're going to be playing. It could just be band repertoire. Just listen to a good band. This is what a good band sounds like. And
Yeah,
like
I've actually had a
learn.
few good. I've had a few good classical teachers tell me, like, if you're learning a piece by Mozart, don't just listen to the piece you're learning. Listen to a bunch of the other pieces that are in the same kind of period that he was writing in, just to get a sense of, like, it's almost like you can generalize a bit. You're like, okay, I have an idea of how this one Mozart piece sounds, but you can play it better if you have an idea of how like 10 Mozart pieces sound. In this kind of whole idiom that he's working with it. This is another technique that you can use as a teacher, especially an instrumental teacher, I find. Um, it takes so much time to get someone to learn something by rote or to decode it or use notation or whatever and to memorize it instrumentally. It's really wise to get students to listen to pieces a long time before you even plan to teach them on the instrument, especially when they're getting to the higher level, because it's just such a nice memory boost. It's like if I get a student to start to learn a classical piece on the guitar that's like 4 or 5 pages long, it's going to require some work to get going. If they've already heard the piece over a period of a few months, it's insane how much more connected they are to the music.
So now
Like,
I got to go another step. Is
yeah.
that I grew up just listening to what my dad enjoyed, right? My mom too, to a lesser degree, but he bounced me on his knee to Toscanini, right, in front of the radio. That's the story. And I know that I hated my brother's music, and I wanted to, be in cahoots with my dad because my older brother was, brilliant, and I was the second child. Um, but I'm, um, I'm sticking with the classical radio station, and I
Mhm.
wake up to it every morning. It's my alarm all the way through high school. And I did play music in fourth grade on and whatnot. But what if I had this early childhood experience with jazz? How much more uh, benefit there would have been to my power, my and what is this? It's a latent memory that's just back
Yep.
that I have, and this
Yep.
connection with classical music. Now, when I listen to classical radio stations, there's just not enough interesting changes for me. I, I can audiate, or
Oh
I
yeah.
can't necessarily identify them all, but I recognize all the changes if it's like Mendelssohn or before. It's just
Sure.
the Baroque music doesn't interest me anymore unless it's a beautiful trumpet or some Bach or you know like
Yeah.
like there's a certain amount that I really love still, and it's not like there isn't anything I now hate because I didn't hear it, in my early childhood.
Yeah, but I
Or
mean, a lot of it is 145 with like big two. I mean that's or 145 just in tonic and dominant,
yeah, and
which is a
then
lot.
and then and then a lot of modulations or whatever.
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean, uh, I've,
So
I've I've had that experience. I don't experience that with like Mozart. Mozart, there's some style thing that he's got dialed in that just like pulls me
yeah,
in.
yeah, but my point is like,
But yeah.
so is like giving a kid, prenatally and the first few months of life, giving them the capacity to develop a listening vocabulary, um,
Mhm.
at the level of their aptitude will allow. And then what is that some kind of latent memory that's kind of in there that like gives rise
Yeah.
to a child becoming a better, a higher aptitude, uh, student
So
later in
so
life.
I have a theory here, and it's not out of left field. It's so we were talking before about the difference between short-term and long-term memory, and I think this is it kind of also brings in the equation between talent and whatever you want to call it, work, right? Talent versus work. But it gets more complicated when we start talking about aptitude, because some of this stuff is much better cultivated at a young age. So, um, some of the research done on the importance of short-term and long-term memory, I believe talked about in the last episode that we posted on E.D. Hirsch and why knowledge matters. But as a quick recap, to just part of that conversation, the researcher John Sweller, who came up with cognitive load theory, which I highly recommend watching if you are a teacher. It's extremely interesting and will kind of dissuade you of this idea that memory is not an important part of learning. Memory is learning. That's what learning is something is in your brain. But
Or
but so what
body.
John Sweller or body, yeah, kinesthetic learning is valid. But what Sweller showed was some of the he uses chess as an analogy here, but some of the research was done on chess masters. The difference between the grandmaster of chess and the intermediate or novice player was not IQ. It was not the ability. Is not working memory ability. It's not your ability to compute chess moves. It's how much chess moves, how many micro chess moves, and how many chess games you've studied that had been committed to memory. So basically, when you are playing, and there's such a beautiful analogy here between audiation and chess. But when a chess player is playing and a grandmaster has never seen this chess position, they intuitively get the sense of what moves make sense and should be further analyzed and what moves shouldn't. But and this somewhat happens in audiation. Like when you're playing over a set of changes, you intuitively get the sense of like where the melody should go and how it should be carved out. But what's really fascinating about this, and you probably heard this if you listen to learning psychology or personal development, the difference in the grandmaster versus the novice, when you show them a chessboard that is nonsense, like the pawns are in places they would never get in a normal game and the king is on the other side, the chess master has no extra power in the game versus the novice because it's entirely based off of his long-term memory giving him this boost. Because your working memory has this limit, 4 to 9 things plus, 7 plus or minus a few. It's probably lower than what most people think. But the way that you bypass this working memory constraint of only being able to focus on a few things is having this humongous storage of schemas in your long-term memory. This is what tonal patterns are. This is what rhythm patterns are. They are micro bits of musical knowledge that are stored in your long-term memory that come to rise when you are participating in music.
Harmonic
Like
patterns are.
harmonic patterns are. Style is too. Style is too. Like, and so what I think happens when you're exposed to music at a younger age, you're just getting this stuff in, like both at a faster rate, because children seem to learn this stuff faster than adults do, which has been very odd with this harmonic learning stuff too. Because I found, I think, a similar thing that Eric has found, even though Eric, your data set is like 1,000 times higher than mine, because I only get 4 or 5 year olds once in a while. I mean, this is a standard issue. But some of my younger students learn the harmonic learning. Not some. The younger students seem to learn the harmonic learning sequence stuff better than the older ones. It's
I
just
had
been
a,
funny to.
I had a 3-year-old in a class yesterday. He's yelling at me, yes, no. And I play whatever he says. And these other kids started playing off of that. And then at some point, um, they're being, it's just so playful. And then I just asked what this one is and what that one is, and like the whole class is like yelling at me what they are. So tonic dominant, and this 3-year-old just you know, was having so much fun. Like, and that's just from exposing them this year. And I lost 2.5, 3 months this year
Hmm.
because COVID.
Oh
Want
yeah,
they didn't
yeah.
want an extra body in the room. Um,
I had a
might
student
get them
who
sick.
started with me. Yeah, yeah. That's. I mean, that's sad. I was teaching most. I've been teaching online since COVID started, actually, still. But I had a student who started with me in September for a few months and was just knocking. He was 4, and he was knocking the harmonic learning sequence just like you know. And I was getting better at doing it too. And then he had to leave lessons after a few months, and I was just like, no.
Yeah, I'm really
Yeah,
fighting with what of that you know is trainable. The
sure.
whether that aptitude is something that can change over time. And
Hmm.
I yeah, I need more kids.
Yeah,
But
I mean
again,
that's
that's
a good question.
again another type of, of identification in that case. They can
Yeah,
rec
and go ahead, go
and they
ahead.
can recognize that Mary Had a Little Lamb doesn't end there and that it does end here. That's a level of being able to retain the song and and the cultural context, or the or tonal context,
Hmm.
that they're recalling that from some experience. So what is that experience? Well, it's whether they got sung to at home, and or go to church, or wherever else they get music.
Yeah. You know what? Like one interesting part of this about aptitude and just how some of these early memories influence us is like I do largely like my ability to improvise has gone up like drastically over the past 10 years. There's no doubt in my mind. But like if you just tell me to improvise just freely, and I'm not trying to make the changes fancy or whatever, I think there's a base level of improvising that I've always had that has never changed, and some of it's gotten more harmonically complicated and interesting from all the patterns and stuff that I've learned. But what I've noticed has largely changed is when I naturally improvise now and I end a note on a certain phrase, I can hear this is related to what I was talking about before. I can imagine that note having like a bunch of different functions attached to it instead. Like, right? Like if I'm just using like free creativity, I'm not trying to outline a set of changes. Like I can imagine more functions being attached to it, but in a lot of ways, the baseline ability to improvise um, has stayed the same. I just have more patterns available to me now. But the seems like the quality has largely, stayed in the same realm
Yeah,
since I was, a teenager.
there's just so many layers to what memory is versus recall, identification, right? Recognition, early childhood, indelibility,
Hmm.
learning. It's like you've just got something that's part of you. Um, how much of that's um, related to the genes or the proteins that get built out of the genes that gives you who you are. Um, there's just not enough um,
Oh
research
yeah,
in this stuff, um, relative to audiation and relative to those stages of audiation. I still
sure.
want to put somebody under functional MRI and see what's actually lighting up in the brain in between the two. So to give a kid or whoever's the person in the functional MRI, I want to know what's happening in those, uh, what is it, a half a second between listening to the first example and music aptitude profile and the second example.
Hmm.
When they
Yeah.
add extra notes, I want to know, I want to see what the brain is doing in between those two uh, items.
Yeah, and you could correlate it.
And then you can
If you
just,
had enough people with high aptitude doing it and enough with lower aptitude, you could start to correlate different
or
brain
just what,
states with.
yeah, just what part uh, lights up. There's a
Mm,
same different, the anterior, uh, what is it? The anterior cingulate in the brain is
mm,
one of the bits um, that does comparisons, same, different, or same, not
mm-hmm.
same, and um, at least in some of the other research, I want to see if that lights up the same way. It might. It
Same difference, really interesting. There's I forget the name of the researcher, but it comes out of like relational frame theory. But the idea of this is that human language and human cognitive processing is relational. It's not associative. So associative conditioning is like Pavlov's dog,
mm-hmm.
right? We tell, or even monkeys, like, right, like push this button and we'll give the monkey a grape. The monkey pushes the button. But what humans get is this extra relationship where if I train a monkey to push a button with a symbol and it gets a grape, I can't I can't ask the monkey, I can't give the monkey a grape and expect him to know what the symbol is. But humans after a certain age start naturally developing this ability where if I say the word of something and hand you the object without being trained, if I give you the object, you can tell me the word. And this is like a really meta process that the human mind goes through. But the reason I want to talk about the same different thing, um, there's a type of training that you can do, and this is really controversial among like learning psychologists because psychologists have been struggling for a long time to find anything that can increase IQ, and it's been a failure for I think 60, 70 plus years. Don't those numbers might be off, but it's been a long time, and we haven't found much that can increase someone's IQ. But this type of training on these relational frames can, and what they do is and I'm going to tie this back to music in a sec, don't worry. But what they do is, they'll say, okay, A is the same as B, and then they ask you a question like, is B the same as A? That's the first level, right? And so there's these syllogisms. They'll be like, if A is the same as B and B is the same as C, is C the same as A? And they grill you with like 50 plus layers of these questions. But what they found is if you train these relationships of same and different and bigger, more and less, people get huge jumps in IQ. And so I started thinking, like, this is why when we were talking a while ago, can aptitude be raised? And every time I was asking you stuff about aptitude, you would tell me, well, like, that just sounds like the stuff we're doing on aptitude tests, right? Like, but can you train that? If I play
Well,
tonic patterns,
we've tried. Listen, everybody's
we,
tried. Dr. Gordon gave the tests over and over again to certain kids, and or to batches of kids, and they never went up or down significantly as a group.
yeah,
As a group,
yeah, fair enough. I mean, it's
and I
interesting.
tried myself. I was
See,
teaching really hard tonal patterns, and I gave the test at the beginning of the year and the end of the year, and again beginning of the next year and the end of the next year. And I was
but see, then part of my mind says, okay, maybe the way that we're doing it doesn't work because psychologists have been trying to do this with mathematical and linguistic abilities for, the better part of 100 years. It might even be 100 years. I'm not sure. I don't know when the concept of working memory was first developed off the top of my mind, but it's only now that we know that we can. I'm not talking about small boosts in IQ. I'm talking about like 20 to 30 point IQ boosts people are getting from doing this training. I wonder if there's some way you can do this with music. I mean, I'd be very excited if you could. The same different phenomenon, but that remains because I mean, what would be better than being able to raise someone's aptitude, like as a music teacher, if you had the power to do that? That would be. Um, I mean, I guess you do if you're teaching young enough. I don't teach those
well,
ages though, so I don't.
that's it's just 1,000,000,000 times more important to get kids before they're 3, and then only a
Yeah.
thousand to get them before they're 5. Um, but um,
But it's usually explained as some kind of like neuronal pruning, right? Like there's some kind of like age range where the cognitive process they just start getting thrown out the window if they're not being exercised. Is that generally, I mean, how it's thought of?
uh, yeah, that's probably part of it, and then it's also what's naturally already there to begin with. And I think what naturally already there is what gets developed in that last trimester in utero, or maybe before.
Hmm.
I don't know what kind of genetic component we could find or how to go about finding it, but I just think that there's never been a kid that's stood out to me in class, and I see their mom come in to pick the kid up, and I say,
Hmm.
I just gotta talk to you a second. And it's like I look at them in the eye. I said, "How much singing did you do, and dancing did you do with your child? When you were pregnant with them?" And the answer was always that just aghast that I already know. But there's never a kid that doesn't
Mm.
stand really far out to me. It's like, what were you doing? And they just take it as like, I was just playing, this in the car or this and that, and then they don't think anything about like how important that was for this child's um, music achievement. At 2, 3, or 4 years old, I can nail
Yeah.
these really top performers, and there's never a mom, never, zero, that didn't say, "Oh, I was absolutely doing this." I did
Yeah.
have a
Yeah.
respondent to my dissertation survey who said that they did very, very little. They did nothing, but the kid was off the scale. So I chose them to
Mm.
interview in an extensive, one-on-one, recorded interview. And I found out, they just basically lied. They were just being humble,
Mm. Mm.
cultural difference,
Yep.
and what they wanted to feel pride in. Kind of, they thought their child was a blank slate, kind of a thing, maybe
Mm.
when they were born. But no, I finally got the truth. That I
Mm.
was not wrong. I was determined to find out how much they sang. Oh, we just sing in our family. Grandmother takes care of her. Grandmother sings. whatever. It's crazy. So where does this memory begin? Where does it end? Where does,
Yeah.
how much implication does it have, and the difference between that and recall and all these other terms? It's really, really, really fascinating. I wish we had the money to do the research.
Well, related to all this stuff I was talking about with the chess masters and their skill being largely dependent on their long-term memory of chess games. I think you get a lot of these same benefits from just as a musician, having lots of patterns in your memory. And I think there is a point where it almost let's say you're someone with medium aptitude. I'm trying to talk tonally for a second. So if someone with medium tonal aptitude who has a lot of patterns in their memory versus someone with super high aptitude who doesn't have a lot of patterns. I mean, we might not really see like big deficits in their composition or their improv. If like the amount of patterns might just at a certain point be better than having more aptitude. The person with the high aptitude might learn them faster and easier, but at a having more patterns might prove to be
Oh,
really
yeah,
really
no,
useful.
people with low aptitude can outgain people in achievement than people with high aptitude. You just need the practice and the right kind of method.
So the last thing I want to talk about was just some practical stuff about retrieval. So if you are a teacher, for example, who's trying to learn sets of tonal patterns to give to your students, or even just increase your own audiation, there are some really practical ways about going about retrieval. And one thing that seems really obvious when you talk about it, but is not done in practice, is uh, block practice versus interleave practice or random practice. So you might know about this stuff if you've read like Noah Kageyama. He's the bulletproof musician guy from Juilliard. He's a sports psychologist, but he was one of the first people that turned me on to this. But there's a lot of research on blocking and interleaving. What I'm getting at is if you are trying to memorize a set of tonal patterns, and you're trying to practice recall, don't keep repeating the same pattern for like 10 minutes straight or 5 minutes straight or even five trials straight. You want to mix it up with other things. So you might want to try to retrieve a tonal pattern like once or twice from memory. Do something else for a few trials, like play something on your instrument that's not related to what you're doing and come back to it, later. Spacing things in time, but also interleaving them will drastically improve how long the
Yeah,
memory
for sure.
sticks with you. And so this is something that people often don't do. Like even musicians, instrumentalists, they'll play the same song over and over and over again, and then they can't play it the next day the first time, and they wonder why. It's because this kind of blocked practice, it doesn't help as much as people tend to think it does. Uh, so that's just kind of a practical takeaway. If you're trying to learn a set of tonal patterns,
Absolutely. I've told parents all the time that their kids should practice twice a day for 5 minutes rather than once a day for 20.
yeah. I mean, I've got my schedule right now is pre and post nap. I try to I try to get everything done before the nap, and then I review everything later in the day after I've slept with the hope or the belief that it has some extra benefit.
Definitely.
Hopefully.
All right.
So,
Well, that's
yeah.
far ranging.
But yeah, memory is important. And I guess the very last thing I'd like to say is that there's often this thing, and this is related to the last podcast, but often teachers are like, I don't want my students to just memorize stuff. I want them to be creative and actually learn and kind of stuff. I would be very cautious with that line of thought that thinks rote memorization is negative for education. I think you can do rote memorization in a way that sucks the life out of learning, but to say that memorizing facts or memorizing tonal patterns or memorizing anything in any domain of learning is bad, and it would be better to just kind of figure everything out on your own. It's a very dubious line of thought that is not backed up by research, and it's kind of turned into this cultural thing in the last 40 years that any kind of rote learning or rote memorization is negative. And yeah, I would recommend that teachers push back on that a little bit and investigate because it's not true. So that's my attempt at equaling the scales.
Yeah. There's
Depends where you live too, right? Like I live in Vancouver in Canada. So it's hyper liberal here in terms of education, to the point where the education science, the psychological learning science, is not even being implemented on this level. It's more ideologies that are taking over how people learn. The research literature just can get thrown out the window.
Yep, somewhere there's good balance, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, that was fun. Until next time.
Indeed.